Happy New Year, guys. Wow, we made it. I kind of forgot it was New Year's. It's been a crazy week at my house. If you don't know, we just had another baby on Friday. Yeah, this is Owen James, 8 pounds, 12 ounces, big, strong boy. I think I have a picture of him meeting Charlotte for the first time. Yeah, there's Charlotte. And then I got a picture of Owen and Luke together. There's Owen and Luke. They grow up so fast. No, I got a real picture of Owen and Luke together. There we go. And I think I got a shot of our whole family for the last one. So mom is doing good. She's healthy and strong. She's healing well. Baby's doing great. Everybody's in love. Luke gets a little bit jealous. But overall, it's really, really great. All right, we are, in our culture right now, we are located right on the edge of what we call a post-Christian culture. See, we've categorized the Western world into 3 different phases. There's pre-Christian. Think of Celtic Ireland, Scotland, England, before the gospel, where child sacrifice was the norm, where slavery was norm. Right? St. Patrick himself was enslaved by the Irish, right? Where there are gods and goddesses behind every bush, tree, and rock, right? Then you move into Christian or Christianized culture, where the cultural norms pull you towards the way of Jesus, not from it. This is England 100 years ago. This is Middle America in the 50s. And then you move into post-Christian culture, where big cities like LA or Portland or Boston are great examples of this. Now, the key thing to remember about post-Christian culture is it doesn't mean that we've moved out from the Christian culture. It doesn't mean that we've moved away. In fact, so many of the values and so much of what the vision of the culture is, both on the left or right of the cultural spectrum, it's rooted in the ways of Jesus. Equality, justice, freedom, being against discrimination, the gap between rich and poor. So much of this is defined not based on evolutionary psychology, but in fact, direct opposition to it. It's based on Jesus' vision of what he called the kingdom of God, which was this socio-political vision on top of a supernatural. But the key thing that we need to get our heads around with post-Christian culture is that it's a reaction against Christian culture. It's like the West's rebellious teenage moment. That's why some of our friends who don't follow Jesus are far more open to things like yoga or kind of quasi-Buddhism with a little organic juice thrown in there, this mindfulness, right, than they are to the ways of God from the Bible. In fact, there's a lot of people that are more into Islam or Judaism because they're so spiritual. They know there's something there, but they're rebelling against the God of the Bible. It's kind of this knee-jerk rebellious moment that we're in. And even if people aren't hostile towards Jesus, on a Sunday morning, there are a million other things you could be doing right now, right? Like we know that if you just went on Instagram, you could see what all your friends are doing, and it looks pretty fun. I think that the most devious thing that Satan ever did to keep people out of church was create brunch, right? I mean, look where we live. You could be at the beach right now. It's beautiful. And being at the church just doesn't make sense to most people. Rosaria Butterfield writes this: let's face it, we've become an unwelcome guest in the post-Christian world. Our children ride their scooters in neighborhoods where conservative Christianity is dismissed or denounced as irrelevant, irrational, discriminatory, and dangerous. Many of us go to work in places where sensitivity training has become an Orwellian nightmare. Christian common sense is declared hate speech by the new keepers of this culture. The old rules don't apply anymore. Many Christians genuinely do not know what to say to their unbelieving neighbors. The language and the logic have changed almost overnight. Right? I'm in my mid-30s, and I've been here for this transition, right? It's only been the last decade or two that this shift has taken place. It was this way, and now it's another. But one of the questions that we have to ask is, how do we invite people to follow Jesus along with us in this post-Christian world? Right? Most of us have come to experience life, or what Jesus calls life to the full, and God has put a love in our heart for our family and our friends. for our neighbors or a barista that you see every day or a coworker or somebody at the gym. We have this love to share and we want to do it, but how? How do we invite people to experience the love that we have and enjoy every single day? In a culture where there's hostility, where we as Christians are no longer PC and we feel awkward or weird and so on to talk about. Well, one option is we just don't. That we don't. That was old school. We moved on from that. We just kind of turn our home or our apartment into a castle. We ball up. When we walk out in public, we put our collar up and we hide and we keep our heads down. In fact, that one's pretty common. It's one of the reasons that we're kind of in the mess that we're in. A lot of people assume the crazy stories they hear about Christians from the news or on TV shows and don't realize that they actually know Christians because we don't talk about it. They don't realize that their neighbors are Christians. Another option is that we just edit the way of Jesus. We update it for the progressive world. We take out all the bits and pieces that aren't PC, which changes every 5 years or so, but we continue to update and alter the Bible to fit current culture. Or is there an option C? Well, I think there is. I think there is a practice that actually transcends time and trend. In fact, one that goes all the way back to Jesus himself. So let's take a look at the Bible. At Luke chapter 19, verse 1. If you have a Bible and you want to read along, go for it. Otherwise, I have it up here. It says, Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but because he was short, he could not see over the crowd. Just a little nerd moment for a second here. Couldn't see over the crowd. We kind of attributed that to Zacchaeus, but in the language, you don't know if that means Jesus couldn't see him over the crowd or if Zacchaeus couldn't see Jesus. Anyway, semantics. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, he has gone to be the guest of a sinner. But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor. And if I've cheated anyone out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Jesus said to him, today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Now, it's easy if you grew up in the church like I did to read this story as this kind of cute, sentimental, Sunday school-ish story, the flannel board and stuff. And it's this moral tale about how Jesus loves short people too. But to the original audience, this would not have been funny or sweet. In fact, the story in itself is actually quite dangerous because it's disruptive to the status quo. It's disruptive to what the expectation is. It says right in the story that people started to mutter. They're whispering, they're gossiping, they're talking about Jesus and what's happening. And they were doing it for 2 reasons. One is that Zacchaeus is a tax collector, which in that society is the worst of the worst. Israel is occupied, it's oppressed by the Roman Empire, and tax collectors were Jews, not Romans, who sold out their own countrymen. They were notoriously corrupt because they made a living by adding their own fee to Rome's taxes. But they're the ones that set that fee, and then they had the backup of the local Roman garrison to back it up, right? So say you're Matthew or you're Zacchaeus, and you're at your toll booth on the road to Capernaum, and Peter's coming with his catch of fish for the day, and you would go and you have to pay Rome's tax on it, which would be something like 50+%, right? And then you would add your own, so we'll make it 60%, right? And if you're a tax collector, and I made you mad during that, then I could say, well, you know what? It's 80% for you today, Peter. Right? And then he can enforce that at the point of a sword, right? You think that our country is a political tinderbox. You can imagine how crazy it'd be for them then and how tax collectors were absolutely hated. Right? In that culture, the 2 lowest rungs on the moral ladder, and every society has a moral ladder, but for them, it was tax collectors and prostitutes, right? And who does Jesus hang out with on a regular basis? Tax collectors and prostitutes, right? Now, I read that and I'm like, Jesus is so punk rock, right? He's like, stick it to the man. He's anti-fundamentalist, right? It's like, let the kids dance footloose, like it's no big deal. And I read it that way because we don't have tax collectors anymore, right? We're not under the Roman Empire. We have the IRS and agents, but that doesn't count. It's not the same thing. We do have prostitutes, but our culture is so hypersexualized that we really think very little of that. It doesn't cross our minds in the same way. We don't have the visceral reaction in the same way that they had back then. So what we want to do is we want to think of, well, what would it look like today? Who are the prostitutes and tax collectors? How can we feel this story more closely? What if I told you, when Jesus came on the scene today, and you heard a story about Jesus sitting and eating dinner with a pedophile? Right? What if he had a bunch of white nationalists that marched in Charlottesville over for lunch? What if you saw a video on YouTube of Jesus eating dinner around a campfire in a cave with a bunch of terrorists? Right? How would that make you feel? How does that thought experiment make you feel right now? Angry? Disgusted? Scared? You can't do that. It's us versus them, good versus evil. How dare you cross that line? Maybe you're confused. Well, that's how those people felt in that day. Secondly, meals meant way more in that society than they do in ours. In every culture, meals either bring people together or they keep people apart. Right? Think of pre-civil rights restaurants in the South with the no black signs on the front door. Or in England, no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. Right? Even today, as a general rule, most of us eat with people who are friends or family exclusively. Most of us, in fact, eat with people who are like us in the same basic socioeconomic circle that we are, or that look like us. And that was especially true of first century Jewish society. New Testament scholars, what they call it is table fellowship. And here's the backstory. This is where it all comes from. 400 years before Jesus, sorry, Adam, history lesson, Israel was dragged off into exile in Babylon, 1,000 miles to the east, right? And when that happened, the temple in Jerusalem was destroyed. The overlap between heaven and earth, the center of the Jewish faith, was destroyed. And the sacrificial system was put to an end, and the priesthood was wiped out. Now imagine you're in Babylon, you're in exile, you're living in the suburb of a city, and you're a slave, or maybe you're a merchant or whatever, and you want to be a good Jew, right? Well, have you read the Torah? If you've been through Genesis and Exodus, like Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, there's a lot there. And how can you obey half of the commands with no temple, with no sacrificial system and no priesthood? I mean, look at Leviticus, it's tricky. Well, the answer is you can't. So the rabbis did something genius. They kind of reinvented Judaism. Now, they didn't call it that, but they reoriented the Jewish faith, and they came up with a new framework. They said, our home is now the new temple. Your table is the new altar. The dad or the father of the house is the new priest, and the meal is the sacrifice, which sounds pretty cool. But then the Pharisees come along, and we forget that the Pharisees started out good. In the New Testament, they kind of got off track. You know, the descendants of Ezra, if you remember that from the Old Testament. Jesus himself, a lot of people think, was a Pharisee. And so when there's this kind of infighting, it's exactly that. It's house rules, infighting from Pharisee to Pharisee, right? But it started out good, and eventually they just kind of lost the plot line. Or the Pharisees had this working theory, and it was like, listen, what got us into this mess was sin. Being in exile was caused by sin. So what we need to do to get out of the mess of exile, to get out of this, is to sin less, or ideally stop sinning at all. So 400 years later, you're in Jesus' day, and we forget that they're kind of back in the land. Well, like a third of them are back in the land, 2/3 are in Egypt and exile and all over the place, but 1/3 are back, and they're still under the Roman Empire, right? It's still in charge. So at least existentially, they're still exiles, right? And they're thinking, how do we get here and how do we get out? And the Pharisees' hypothesis was, okay, if all of Israel to just keep the Torah for one day, one 24-hour period, then that would unlock something, right? And the Messiah would come back and the exile would enter and it would usher in the new kingdom of God, which sounds pretty cool. So what they did was they upped the ante on the Bible narrative. They called for everybody, for every Jew, not just the priests in the temple, but every Jew, because now the home is the temple, your tables, the altar, and so on and so forth. They up the ante on holiness. It's a Reformation movement for them, right? But if you know the commands about the priests and the commands about the temple, and we don't have time to get into it, but that meant no Gentile, no non-Jewish person was ever allowed in your house, much less to sit at your table. Nobody with special needs, nobody that had a deformity, and most importantly, not anybody who was a sinner, which is a way of saying anybody who is not Torah observant. So you see what's going on? So all that to say, a rabbi in that culture, a teacher of the Torah, would never be caught dead in the home of somebody like Zacchaeus, right? New Testament scholar Scott Barchi writes, it would be difficult to overestimate the importance of table fellowship for the cultures of the Mediterranean basin in the first century. Mealtimes were far more than occasions for individuals to consume nourishment. Being welcomed at a table for the purpose of eating food with another person had become a ceremony richly symbolic of friendship, intimacy, and unity. Thus, betrayal, unfaithfulness towards anyone with whom one had shared the table was viewed as particularly reprehensible. On the other hand, when persons were estranged, a meal invitation opened the way to reconciliation. Another German theologian said it like this: in the East, even today, to invite a person to a meal was an offer of peace, trust, brotherhood, and forgiveness. Sharing a table meant sharing life, and Judaism in particular, table fellowship means fellowship before God for the eating of a piece of broken bread by everyone who shares in a meal. It brings up the fact that they all have a share in the blessing which the master of the house has spoken over the unbroken bread. The inclusion of sinners in the community of salvation achieved in table fellowship is the most meaningful expression of the message of the redeeming love of God. One theologian I read said this: Jesus had gotten himself killed because of the people he ate with, because he ate with all the wrong people. You see, for Rabbi Jesus, meals were not a boundary marker, but a sign of God's great welcome into the kingdom. Not a way to keep people out, but a way to invite people in. Right, notice that line from verse 10, it says, for the Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. Now, if you're the original audience, you wouldn't have read this. And you certainly would not have read a paragraph or two like we did today. You would have heard it out loud. This is an oral society. There's no codex. We're 1,400 years off from Gutenberg. This may have existed on a document somewhere, but it was put to memory. And then somebody would stand up and recite the whole darn thing in one sitting for you or your house or your church or whatever. And being an oral society, your ear is attuned to hear. And you hear things that repeat. And that was this way of saying something that we repeated is very important. So when you hear that line, the Son of Man came, your ears would perk up because Luke had already used that phrase earlier in the book. Chapter 7, let me show you. Verse 33, Jesus is teaching and he says, for John the Baptist came neither eating bread or drinking wine, and you said he has a demon. The Son of Man came, there it is, eating and drinking, and you say, here is a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. But wisdom is proved right by all her children, which is one of Jesus' great one-liners. And of course, the story continues with Jesus going to Simon the Pharisee's house for a meal, and he has a prostitute that washes his feet with her tears and perfume. And these two stories about Jesus eating and drinking with sinners, they're actually the rule. They're not the exception. Those are two out of dozens of stories of Jesus eating and drinking in the four Gospels. He was called a glutton and a drunkard for a reason, right? I don't think he actually was one, but he got the reputation for a reason. In the Gospel of Luke alone, there's over 50 references to Jesus and food in Luke alone. In Matthew, there are 94 separate references to Jesus dealing with food, right? New Testament scholar Robert Karras writes, in Luke's Gospel, Jesus is either going to a meal, at a meal, or coming from a meal. Now, I don't know about you guys, but I want to apprentice under Jesus. I want to be like him. I want to do what he did. Let me eat. In Luke, the Son of Man came was not used once but twice, like I said. And one is talking about Jesus' mission, right? But the other is talking about Jesus' methodology. The Son of Man came to seek and to save the lost. That's Jesus' mission. That's what he's come to do. The Son of Man came eating and drinking. That was Jesus' methodology. That's how he did it. Jesus lived in a culture where a lot of people were hostile or at arm's length towards him and his way into the kingdom. Sound familiar? So how did Jesus walk people into that kingdom? Well, the short answer is one meal at a time. That was his method of evangelism, or we would call it outreach. If Jesus had a method of outreach, best as I can tell from the Gospels, it's this. If you're with a bunch of conservatives, cultural Christians, who for the most part, they believe in the Bible. For the most part, they believe in God, and they just kind of maybe lost the plot line. And they need to come back, but deep down, they know what the truth is. Then stand up in a crowd, get as many people together as you can, and preach. But if you're with somebody who's on the margins, who maybe has been hurt by the church, or God forbid, the family of God, they had a bad experience in the past, if they just didn't measure up because of who they were born into the wrong home scenario, the wrong moral or social or economic place. If somebody, for whatever reason, just wants nothing to do with organized religion, the better option is to open your home. And if you don't have one, and they do what Jesus did. Invite yourself over and get them to pay for the whole thing. Eat a long meal. Stretch it out into the night. Have a bottle of wine if you're cool with that. If they run out of wine, ask for water. You can make that work too. But spend time with people that no good, upstanding religious leader would ever be caught dead with. Talk small talk. That's an expression of love. Talk about the meaning of life. And don't just talk, but ask questions. And listen, really listen. Meet people where they're at, not where you assume they should be. Love people and invite them to experience a life that is normative for you in the kingdom. That's it. The eating and the drinking with the lost, and we'll get to that word in a minute, but that's what the New Testament writers call hospitality. This is a word that we need to get back to. It's a word philoxenos in Greek. It's a compound word, right? Philos means love. Think Philadelphia, right? The city of brotherly love, which is based on the church in Revelation 2. But xenos, it means stranger, foreigner, immigrant, refugee, outsider, or simply just guest. So you think about xenophobia, it's the opposite of hospitality. It's the fear, the phobia of the stranger, the outsider, the immigrant, whatever. But hospitality, what it actually means is the love of the stranger, the outsider, the immigrant, the refugee, the guest. It's the welcoming in. Butterfield defined it as turning strangers into neighbors and neighbors into family. I've heard hospitality defined as expressing the love of God the Father to all through tangible acts of love, ideally through giving food, shelter, and relationship. But it's hard to define because hospitality is first and foremost a posture of the heart. And that has to then leak out of your life and your budget and your time with intangible acts. That's why when Lance is up here leading worship, it's a practice of hospitality. It's welcoming and inviting us into this room. And as followers of Jesus, we're commanded to continue that practice of hospitality all over the New Testament. In fact, 1 Timothy 3 and Titus 1, the practice of hospitality is part of the job requirement and the character quality list for elders or leaders in the church. You have to practice hospitality in order to lead up here or anywhere in the church. You know, I've heard a lot of pastors being removed for like affairs or funny business with money, but I've never once heard a story of a pastor being removed for not practicing hospitality. Right? We're not like, hey, dirty little secret, guess what I found out? Mark hasn't had anybody over to his house in 3 nights. Right? Sinner, he's out of here. You know, that's not. But it's in the exact same list, right? And we're commanded to carry on this practice from Jesus' life, and it's a great one. I love it, and I love it because it's so ordinary, and yet it's so full of potential. Rosaria Butterfield, I've been talking about her a lot, but I'm just fascinated because she's just a case study on this. She's basically was this far left radical lesbian feminist. She was a tenured professor at Syracuse University, with a specialty in postmodern critical theory and literature. She would not call herself a prime candidate for the Jesus story. And she was writing a book on how Bible-believing Christians are just basically the worst, how we are a threat and a menace to society. But as part of her research, she had to meet a few Bible-believing Christians first. And she'd written this scathing editorial in a New York paper about a men's conference that she read about, and how it was everything she was against. And a local pastor, he wrote a letter, a response to her article. And it was gracious and it was thoughtful, and it came with an invitation to dinner. And she was thinking, well, I have to do some research anyway, so I might as well go over there. And she writes about sitting in this guy's driveway. And she's like, should I go in there? Like, this is the enemy, and I'm about to go into his house. But she, in spite of feeling crazy, she goes in anyway. She walks in the front door, and she writes about experiencing hospitality, experiencing love, and love expressed as welcome over a meal. And she came back for dinner again and again and again. And then she came to Bible study. And then she joined a small group. And eventually she started going to church on Sunday. And this is a while ago, but long story short, she's actually now married to a Reformed Presbyterian pastor. They live outside of Duke University. She's a foster parent. And they run a Christian commune out of their house because of hospitality. And her message, she's a great writer, but her message, as far as I can tell, is the LGBT community does a way better job at hospitality than the church does, right? But that is a practice we need to recapture. We have a heritage with hundreds of years of church tradition behind us. Anyway, she writes this: radically ordinary hospitality, I'm gonna steal that phrase. Those who live it see strangers as neighbors and neighbors as family of God. They recoil at reducing a person to a category or a label. They see God's image reflected in the eyes of every human being on earth. Those who live out radically ordinary hospitality see their homes not as theirs at all, but as God's gifts to use for the furtherance of his kingdom. They open doors, they seek out the underprivileged, they know that the gospel comes with a house key. How good is that line? The gospel comes with a house key. Hospitality is very ordinary business, but in its ordinariness is its real worth. Whatever it looks like, your own table is a sacred place. And it turns out the gospel pairs really well with a glass of wine or a fresh loaf of sourdough bread and a little homemade tomato soup. And just to make sure we're all on the same page, because some of you may have tuned me out after this, we tend to confuse two things. And I want to clarify that hospitality is not the same thing as entertainment. When I say hospitality, or when you read that in the New Testament, for a lot of us, what comes to mind would be like Martha Stewart here, right? It's picture perfect table, an interior designer has definitely been involved, a formal dining room and fine china, it's all matching. Or you have this 50-foot table in the backyard and the lights over everything and everybody's slightly Norwegian and beautiful. But if that's your idea of hospitality, it writes off the vast majority of us in this room, right? You can't do that if you're a student at UCI and you live in a dorm or rent an apartment and your 4 guy roommates haven't figured out you're supposed to wash your bath towel yet, right? Or if you don't know how to cook or you're just poor. I remember living off of Top Ramen for a long time, right? Or maybe you just don't have that matching ditchware yet, or you're not Norwegian. But the picture perfect magazine cover is not what the New Testament writers meant by hospitality. That's entertainment. To compare and contrast, entertainment is about exclusion. You invite your in crowd. Hospitality is about inclusion. It's an open table where all are welcome. Entertainment is about performance. You show off your home, your culinary skills, the money you have to buy things, where you live. Hospitality is about service. It's tangible love. With entertainment, there's a clear line between host and guest. Hospitality blurs that line. Right? That's what I love about the stories about Jesus at meals. Wherever he went, Jesus was both host and guest. He always came to both give and to receive. It's a pattern. When you show up to life group on a Wednesday, it doesn't matter who you are. You go over to the same house every single week, and you're a host just as much as you are a guest. You come to contribute and to consume, right? I think of Allie Adams, here on a Sunday, she takes and holds whatever baby is fussing so that the parents can watch Seth's message, right? That's hospitality. Entertainment is sporadic. You schedule it out weeks in advance. It's an event on your calendar. There's nothing wrong with that. But hospitality is a way of life. It's regular. It's rhythmic. Sure, it's an event once in a while, but more than anything, it's spontaneous. It's an open door policy, right? It comes with a house key. Entertainment is an act of reciprocity. I have you over, and then it's your turn to have me over, right? We do this at lunch, right? Hey, I got this one, and you're going to get the next one, right? It's reciprocity. But hospitality is an act of generosity. You give and expect nothing in return because the giving in and of itself is the gift. Entertainment, on that note, is a marker of where you are on the social ladder. Do you move up or down based on the party that you just had? Whereas hospitality is about justice for the poor. Jesus said later in Luke to all his disciples, when you throw a party, do not invite your friends or brothers or sisters or relatives or rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back and so you'll be repaid. Which I'm like, yeah, okay, that sounds great, Jesus. What's wrong with that? But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous. Now, New Testament scholars, they point out this radical shift in the society for that day. Hospitality was already a high value in the ancient Near East. It still is today. But where Jesus made not a subtle tweak, but a radical overhaul, was instead of aiming hospitality upward as a way of meriting favor, he aimed downward as a way to serve and do justice for the poor, to bring others into the life that you enjoy. And that has actually changed the world. That historians argue that this is how the gospel spread at such a rapid pace. From around Jesus' death and resurrection, right, around 120-ish people, around a table in an upper room in Jerusalem, this tiny sliver of a sect of the sliver of a sect on the edge of an empire, to 3 centuries later, it's a dominant religion, the new normal. Over half the empire is in some way, shape, or form a follower of Jesus, to the point of completely toppling paganism. Like, do you guys know anybody that worships Zeus anymore? Right? It's gone now. Toppling Caesar himself. Some people think the empire because they're excuse me. And some people think even toppling the empire because we're preaching that there's another Lord, not Caesar, but Jesus. There's another kingdom, not the Roman Empire. Most historians speculate that Constantine's conversion during the 4th century was a political power play. Right, because a persecuted minority became a political majority. Half of his constituents were all of a sudden, in some shape or form, a follower of Jesus, of the way. And he had to make the official religion of the empire, and so on and so forth. So how did this happen? With no internet, no sound system, no church building, for the most part illegal, no religious freedom, no celebrity pastors, not a single follower on Instagram. The gospel spread from one home to the next, one table to the next, all over the breaking of bread and wine. Is this coming into focus? Radically ordinary hospitality is central to the way of Jesus. It's not just a subcategory, it's central. It's right at the core of hundreds of years, into the Middle Ages and beyond, the center of how we did outreach. And tragically, it's something I think we've lost in the West. We have this hyper-individualism. I do life alone. It's the suburbanization of city planning. I remember growing up in the Canyon, I knew every single person for miles where I grew up. Now it's like illegal to have a front yard in Irvine, right? We drive right into our garages and we never have to meet our neighbors, right? And don't even get me started on online community. That's just ridiculous. But for all sorts of reasons, we've lost this. And I think you would agree that it is not something that we value anymore. We've lost it as central to our way of life and discipleship to Jesus. But what if we recaptured it? What if we at Pacific Church were to recapture radically ordinary hospitality as central to our way of life? What if the main way, not the only way, but the first thing that came to mind as we joined Jesus on his quest to seek and to save the lost, well, let me think of that word lost for a second as we wrap this up. That the more I think about Jesus' language, the more I love it. Or Jesus is amazing because he assumes the best in people. Right? Or think about lost. A lost person, somebody who's lost, is not immoral. A lost person isn't bad. Right? Most lost people I know, they're kind of middle of the bell curve when it comes to morality. A lost person is not unintelligent. Right? Everyone gets lost at some point in their life. Right? I get lost every time I drive. Right? We have a rule in the car that Jesus is always to assume I don't know where I'm going, even if we're going home. Right? Lost people rarely want to be lost. And most people are searching for the right path and the right destination when they are lost. So it makes sense that Jesus would call people who have yet to find their way into the kingdom lost. And Jesus himself said he came from heaven to earth. He gave up all that to seek and to save the lost, to open the door and spread out the welcome mat into the Father's house, to invite people in off the street if need be, to eat and drink around the Father's table, and if they wanted, to be adopted into their family as brothers and sisters and sons and daughters. And how did he do it? Hospitality, by eating and drinking one meal at a time. And I would argue that in our post-Christian culture, to bring it full circle, with all the hostility and busyness and noise, Jesus' way is still the best way. The best way to walk people that we love into the kingdom. There's still no better way to get to know a person than over a meal. And there's still no better venue to dialogue and discuss and disagree in love and respect than over a meal. And because of that, I would argue there's still no better environment to share the gospel. The main way that we communicate with people that don't follow Jesus is not here on stage, but over a meal. Hospitality is a safe place to express the welcome and the love of God. And that's it. I love it, and I love the beauty of this practice. It's something that you're all already doing, right? You eat on a regular basis. Most of us eat 2 or 3 meals plus a day. That's 21-ish times a week. You have a chance to practice hospitality. You just take what you're already doing and repurpose or redeem it for the kingdom. Right? Meet up with somebody before you go to work. Grab a coworker on your lunch break. Grab some sliders on the way home. Invite a neighbor over for dinner. Throw a block party on the weekend. You don't need to add anything to your already over busy schedule. Just unlock the front door. And the wonderful thing about this is that we all can do this. Every single person in this room. Because we confuse hospitality and entertainment, a lot of times we come up with excuses for why we can't do this. Right? I'm just not in the season right now, right? I live at home or a dorm. I have roommates. My apartment's a mess. I don't know how to cook. I'm not an extrovert. I don't like to entertain. I have little kids and they need to go to bed too early. My home is too small. My furniture is all used from IKEA and Craigslist. We think of hospitality as a feminine role. I'm a guy. I can't do that. And most of our excuses are exactly that, excuses. And they're easily overcome. My house is a mess, so clean it up. Right? It's not that hard to tidy, right? I don't know how to cook. You got Wi-Fi? Google rice bowl, watch it on YouTube. It's not that hard to learn how to cook good food today. My point is, you don't need to put this off. You don't need a seminary degree and all the answers to every hypothetical apologetic question or a doctorate in that. You don't need a picture-perfect family unit. Your house doesn't need a formal dining room. All you need is a table, and it doesn't even need to be yours, right? Go out, find a Zacchaeus, invite yourself over. That's great. Just find a table. Go out if you need to. Just love them. Be welcoming. Express love in a tangible way through conversation. And just sit back. No ulterior motive. No agenda. No bait and switch. You be who you are. You love Jesus. You follow Jesus. That's who you are. Bring that to the table and be there. Be present for the person in front of you. attune to the Spirit inside of you, and watch what God does over time. I think we'll all be surprised. Let me pray. Father, I thank you for the ordinary practice of hospitality, for giving us a tool to reach out to people in this world that's so simple, but its simplicity is what makes it dynamic. And I just pray that you'll give us each opportunities to invite people over, to share a meal with them, to allow them to experience the gospel through relationship. Or that we understand we don't need to have all the answers, that we don't have to be experts in theology, but Lord, we can bring what we have. I love Jesus. I've experienced a new way to live, and I want to share that with you. Lord, I pray that we all are just given multiple opportunities in the coming future to practice hospitality in our lives. Lord, we love you, and we're so thankful for you. In Jesus' name, amen.